Well, good morning or good day, everyone, wherever you might be for today's Middle East Institute event. My name is Michael Nagata. I'm a retired U.S. Special Operations Officer and a distinguished senior fellow for the Middle East Institute. It is my privilege to be your moderator for today's important discussion on the topic of Israeli defense in a changing Middle East. For those of you that have dialed in for this event, if you wish to pose a question for our various panelists over the course of this event, please use your Q&A tab in the Zoom software so that you can pose questions, but I will forewarn you, we have so much ground to cover today with only an hour. It'll be hard to get in a lot of questions, but we'll do our best. Now, our goal today is to help all participants better understand how Israeli security needs will interact with a Middle East environment undergoing rapid and complex strategic change. Our expert panelists today will help us understand the significance of such topics as Israel recently becoming affiliated with our U.S. Central Command, as opposed to its long history with U.S. European Command. The obvious strategic importance of the Abraham Accords as a new and very different convergence of values and interests with the Gulf states, a warmer peace with Egypt, tensions with Turkey, and what potential, if any, for a conflict with Iran, and more broadly, the future outlook for regional defense and security. We have three distinguished individuals joining us today for this discussion. First, we have Lieutenant General Moshe Yalon. General Yalon served for 37 years in the Israel Defense Forces, rising to the position of Chief of the General Staff. Following his military retirement, he joined the Likud Party, winning election to Parliament in 2009 and again in 2012. He served in successive Israel governments as Minister of Strategic Affairs and Minister of Defense. Next, we have Mr. Mick Mulroy. Mr. Mulroy is a non-resident senior fellow and co-director of the Yemen Steering Initiative at the Middle East Institute. He is also the co-founder of the Lobo Institute, a firm that provides consulting, advising, and teaching on current and future conflicts. He is a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, and as the DASD for the Middle East, he was responsible for U.S. defense policy across that entire region. He is a retired CIA paramilitary officer and U.S. Marine. He's also a member of the Board of Directors for Grassroots Reconciliation Group, a nonprofit to help rehabilitate child soldiers. And last but not least, Dr. Marwa Maziad. Marwa is a visiting professor of Israel Studies at the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland, a senior faculty fellow at the Center for Israel Studies at American University in Washington, D.C., and a non-resident scholar at the Defense and Security Program at the Middle East Institute. Her research focuses on comparative civil-military relations and defense policies in Israel and other Middle Eastern countries. She offers regular political analysis and commentary on BBC Arabic, Al Jazeera English, I-24 News, and other international media. So with the introductions out of the way, let's rapidly shift to our first question, and hopefully that will begin the stimulation of a very robust and informed and well-informed discussion on this important topic. General Yalon, I would like to start with you. As I foreshadowed earlier, I'd like to begin with your perspective on what the significance for Israel and for the broader region might be of the still relatively recent shift by United States policy of Israel becoming now affiliated with our U.S. Central Command, as opposed to its long history of both being associated with our U.S. European Command. Once you're done, I'll give both Mick and Marwa an opportunity to give their perspective on this as well. General Yalon, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me on this very important discussion. The only constant in the Middle East is a change, dramatic changes. I believe that the Middle East is engaged in the most significant crisis since the days of Muhammad in the 7th century. Nevertheless, just to demonstrate the change, as a Chief of General Staff until 2005, I was not allowed to meet CENTCOM commander because CENTCOM was responsible to our neighboring Arab countries, and it was too sensitive that the CENTCOM commander might meet the Israeli Chief of General Staff. The first time that I met CENTCOM commander was after my retirement. Nevertheless, in the last decade or so, Israel has become one of the Arab Gulf countries on the same boat, let's put it this way. In one hand, we have found ourselves on the same side when we deal with Iran as an enemy, with jihadists as terrorists in the region, as well as Turkey, in the way that Erdogan is claiming to have a neo-Ottoman empire led by himself as a sultan, based on the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. On all these issues, we and the Gulf states, the Arab countries, are on the same side. So for years, I claimed that there is no Israeli-Arab conflict anymore. Might be for meanwhile, but today there is no. There is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, still exists. And you can see it is reflected and demonstrated on the Arab Accord, but even before. It has become public in the Abraham Accords, but this kind of strategic relationship exists for a couple of years. To include, of course, Jordan since 1970, before signing the peace accord, Egypt after 1977, President Sadat visit to Jerusalem and the peace accord with Egypt. So this is a dramatic change in the Middle East. And in this regard, we share many common interests with our neighboring countries, not just enemies and rivals. Also, the idea of a cooperation on high-tech, exploitation of water, sophisticated agriculture, many common interests which have developed the relationship between Israel and our neighboring countries. This is a new Middle East.
It is indeed. Thank you. I'd like to toss the same question over to Mick Mulroy. Mick, having done my own couple of hitches in the Pentagon, I can imagine that this shift of responsibility from European Command to CENTCOM had both important strategic implications for the Department of Defense and the US government more broadly, and probably a lot of bureaucratic implications as well. But take this wherever you want to. What do you think this meant, just both to the US Department of Defense and US government policy more broadly?
Yes, Mike, that's absolutely correct. And first, greetings to everybody, all my panelists, fellow panelists, everybody that's watching today. But as you mentioned, I was in the Pentagon as the Middle East person, so I can't say I was from an unbiased perspective, but being as objective as I can, I think there were good arguments, quite frankly, on both sides. And one of the key factors, I think, was the biggest threat to our key partner is Iran. And Iran is obviously in Central Command. And as our distinguished guest from Israel said, he was precluded from even talking to the CENTCOM commander. And when it comes to even the basic level of command and control, should any conflict happen to arise, and we all hope it does not, the ability to communicate is key. So I think that was the factor that really decided the issue, and CENTCOM became responsible, at least from the American military perspective, for the relationship with Israel. Now, one of the factors that also happened is the allocation of resources. And as you well know, Mike, the chairman and his staff spend a lot of time making sure that they're adequately arrayed around the world based on the threat. And it was clear from the discussion that it wouldn't mean a substantial shift from the European Command to Central Command, that if that was needed, it would come later. But from the command and control perspective, and from the ability to communicate and prepare, I think it was the right answer. And I think that, and I would like to highlight, because all Marines do, this is the 246th birthday of my beloved Marine Corps today. And I think we saw this week that the Marine Corps, working with Israeli Maritime Special Operations Forces, conducted an amphibious exercise in Israel. And maybe the general can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was a milestone. And I think it really emphasizes the shift to Central Command with that. So I'll stop there, but I know we're going to talk a lot more about the threat coming from Iran, but I'll wait my turn for that to come up.
Yes, we will indeed get there. Marwa, would you like to add anything to this about the shift from European Command to Central Command?
I think it's a significant shift to move Israel under the category of the Middle East as opposed to Europe in everything. Even when they were to play soccer, football final games to qualify for the World Cup, they would play in Europe versus within the Middle East. So this dislocation of Israel to make it belong to Europe forever like that, I think it has a cultural and symbolic significance in of itself, that Israel is integrated in the geography it is in, and it has to deal with the neighbors next to it. And in a sense, it also signals that it's implicated for better or worse in the good aspects of this region and also the pathologies of this region at large. So in a sense, it's leveling the narrative about Israel that it's one of the Middle East countries. And then we see even some trends, political, cultural, economic, and otherwise, manifesting in Israel. And when we discuss them in that respect with other countries, I think we reach more real conclusions, realistic conclusions. So I think CENTCOM, this designation in terms of actual defense and military dimension is one of many other dimensions. I think it brings them together for the cooperation they need to vis-a-vis threats, but also as a whole, it allows Israel to be located within the region for better or worse, as we will discuss later.
Indeed, thank you. All right, we have already mentioned the Abraham Accords at least once or twice in our initial back and forth, so I'm going to focus on that now. So General Yalan, I'd like to come back to you. I'm going to phrase, this is such an important and enormous topic that we could literally spend the rest of this session just talking about the implications of the Abraham Accords. But let me pose the question to you this way. When future historians try to write books and future PhD level papers about what the effect of the Abraham Accords once were, what do you believe will be the enduring implications that those and future historians will focus on?
I claim that the future is fixed, but it's very difficult to predict. The past is always changing about historians. Nevertheless, I believe that Abraham Accords demonstrates the end of the Israeli-Arab conflict. We used to be offended by the Arabs. It was Arab coalition, Pan-Arabism, Nasserism, Ba'athism. Israel was an enemy which unified the Arab world. This is not the case anymore. I would have said that the Arab countries used the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as an excuse to be unified against us. And you can see that our neighboring countries are not hostages anymore of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a dramatic change. Of course, it reflects the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself, its priority regarding the new Middle East. Nevertheless, as we share common interest with our neighboring Arab countries, they don't need such an excuse. More cooperation rather than animosity. And I believe that hopefully we will witness a progress, which is ongoing now, progress regarding economic relationship. Many Israelis are going and coming back from Abu Dhabi, Dubai, North Africa, to start new business, startups, and to bring what we enjoy here in Israel, all kinds of innovations, startups, as I mentioned, the exploitation of water in a very short Middle East, short of water, and sophisticated agriculture. So I believe that historians might call it a new era of a new Middle East.
Thank you. I'd like to ask one follow-up since you mentioned the Palestinians, and I'm sure many of our participants today would be curious about this as well. From your perspective, well, let me say it this way. As I've been watching news commentary and think tank analysis being published since the signing of the Abraham Accords, I've seen arguments that this creates a window of opportunity to at least begin reducing, if not ultimately eliminating, the sources of tension between the Israeli government and the Palestinians. I've seen other arguments that argue exactly the opposite, that this will only make things worse. From your perspective, what do you think the most likely trajectory is now of the historic frictions between Israel and the Palestinians?
We heard too many times until recently that the core for instability in the Middle East is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I claim that it was and it is nonsense, to be blatant. The Shia-Sunni conflict is not because of us or the Palestinians. Of course, the conflict between Iran as a regime and the Arab countries is not because of us. The collapse of nation states like Libya, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon now in a crisis, it's not because of us. The revolution in Egypt was not because of us. So it was very wrong diagnosis. And if you have a wrong diagnosis, you might get the right prognosis. I believe that the current situation, and this is what I witness in Washington and other capitals, not talking about the Arab capitals, more realistic approach. There is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but all the problems of the Middle East is not because of this conflict. We have to deal with it. So to deal with it in a more realistic way, in one hand, I believe that all of us, to include the Arab leaders, are frustrated from what we have witnessed since Oslo with the Palestinians. We tried very hard, even before, all kinds of territorial compromises, which were responded by our neighboring Palestinians by war. Since the Peel Commission, in the 30s, the Great Arab Rebellion, 47, the partition plan proposal, which was responded by an offensive on Israel, which we call it the Independence War, and they call it the Nakba, and even Arafat's response to Prime Minister Barak in Camp David was what they call Al-Aqsa Intifada. So to be more realistic, we have to look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as an issue which are not going to solve in the near future, not because of us, I claim, because of their reluctance to recognize our right to exist as a Jewish state in any boundaries. And if this is in mind, let's talk about Israeli interests, whether we want to control them or to have this kind of disengagement, like Oslo, which is one of the fruits of Oslo. They have political independence. We don't want them to be second-class civilians or to vote with the Knesset because of our interests. And let's make a progress from the bottom up rather than rushing to sign agreements like Oslo or ceremonies in the White House. Let's make progress from the bottom up according to our interests. In this regard, I believe that we can share this kind of what I call the way rather than the solution with our friends in the Arab capitals as well.
Thank you. Marwa, this is an area of serious study for you. What is your perspective on whether it's the emergence of the Abraham Accords or its implications regarding the Israel-Palestine relationship?
Well, I think that the Abraham Accords, first of all, they are the product of almost a decade or longer of covert, kind of under the table relations that were focused exclusively on security. So there were security relations between Israel and other Gulf states, but it was limited to that. I think what propelled that to come eventually to the forefront and to the open goes back to 2015, the signing of the Iran deal with the Obama administration. That signaled to the Gulf states and Israel that they are really almost rendered irrelevant, ignored, sidelined, and that brought them together. They were not consulted. The United States was looking at that almost as a bilateral situation between Iran and the United States, or the European countries and the world community, but really ignored these countries. So that left them in the same spot together. And that's what I mean by CENTCOM bringing that, situating Israel where it is, which is in the Middle East, not in Europe or the United States for that matter. So I think that was the idea of let's act together as a front, we meaning the Gulf states and Israel, as a front to what that change is bringing. And eventually the pressure to really make it out in the open was the claim from the UAE that Netanyahu was about to really annex the West Bank, and therefore if the United Arab Emirates thought if we create this peace agreement or normalization agreement, then maybe that will put a hold on that. And it worked. But I don't think that this is the main motivator. I think there was the sense of UAE and the Gulf countries want to be on par with Israel in terms of the relationship to the United States and to Europe and other countries. And I would always also say that it's not just Israel that is the more advanced in this relationship. In fact, I think Israelis really wanted to see what Dubai was like. They really wanted to see how advanced the Gulf countries are. The number of universities there, the science and technology parks there. So in a sense, Israel was almost, deprived of what is going on in the Gulf, and now it became in its own interest to do that. So it was mutual, and I think moving forward, this is not going to be overturned. Many people thought that this is going to be a blip, and it will be a cold peace, and we see it's very, very warm. People to people are traveling, and I think that's going to be here to stay. But we need to understand the inception story, why it came together. I think it's an unintended consequence, perhaps, from the Iran deal in 2015.
Thank you. All right, Mick, obviously would be very interested to know what your military, national security perspective is here, but you've got a pretty diverse background, so you can come at this any way you'd like.
So Mike, I think I'd start a little broader when it comes to the Abraham Accords. Our national security strategy prioritizes our strategic competition with China and Russia. And as you well know, because we've written on this collectively from MEI, a lot of people have interpreted that as a substantial shift away from the Middle East. Not just because of my current and past occupations, but I think that is a mistake to view it that way. I wouldn't argue with the prioritization, but I would say that we shouldn't look at strategic competition with countries like China and Russia as simply geographic. If we should look at more of what their actions are, and if their actions are to become more involved in the Middle East and try to gain more influence in the Middle East, perhaps the strategic competition would be in the Middle East. So, and other areas of the world. So not just focused on that. So I think that is something that we're going to have to work through when it comes to US foreign policy globally, because where the diplomacy goes, so does our security assets. So I'd start with that. And the reason why I do is because I think the Abraham Accords allow us to do several things. One, they provided stability in the region, which is good for our partners and good for us. I think it will provide, and it already has, economic opportunities for our key partners, which is good for the United States. And three, to the extent that we do need to shift some resources based on the pivot, as we all call it, the two things I just mentioned would allow that to happen. So I do think the Abraham Accords obviously are positive things. I do think they're here to stay, and I do think they allow us to have flexibility when it comes to our military posture in the Middle East. And I think that's a positive. for the United States, and because of the environment, it's a positive for our key partners in the region.
Mick, I want to ask you one just brief follow-up because it connects to the question I'm about to ask, which, for fair warning for the other panelists, I want to shift to the question of Iran in just a moment. But purely from the military perspective and your military experience, particularly the last position you had, what do you think the implications are in terms of military or security-related cooperation across the Middle East from the US perspective?
So I think that's one of the key, like I already mentioned, that's one of the key reasons why Central Command has become responsible, at least from the US military perspective, for the relationship with Israel. I think that the threat is obviously real coming from Iran. As I'm sure all of the panelists know, there's been media reports, so I don't have any specific information, but there's been media reports of a growing urgency coming from the foreign minister of Israel and the army chief of staff about Iran's ambitions for a nuclear weapon. So I don't have any information other than what I'm reading in the media, and I'm an analyst in the media. So I think that is concerning because I don't think that those kind of statements would be made without merit. And if that is in fact happening, that is something that needs to be addressed by our countries, by our key partners, Israel obviously, but also the other key partners we have in the region. I would hope it doesn't lead to any actions necessary. I think that has a substantial chance of escalation, of which would be in nobody's interest. I would like to see the current administration's efforts to get Iran back into in compliance with the former nuclear agreement, JCPOA. I know that wasn't a very popular agreement, but to the extent it prevents them, or at least gives them the incentive not to get to the point where they could have a nuclear weapon, where actions would have to be taken, I think it would be a good thing. So I know it doesn't look like those discussions are going to be successful, but I think we should all hope they are, to the extent it does reverse, if you will, their current trajectory, which looks like it is on a path to acquire a weapon. So to your specific question, Mike, I think that the cooperation, if that does happen to be the case, and there is action that needs to be taken from a military perspective, we want to have the best coordination that we possibly can have, and that is with the cooperative partners and a unified chain of command, so to speak, from the US perspective.
Thanks very much. Okay, as I foreshadowed, let's talk about Iran. General Yalan, I'm going to come to you rather understandably first. But as I look back just over the last decade or maybe even less, there's been some very large changes in the way the US has related to this challenge. Several administrations ago, of course, was established the Joint Combined Plan of Action regarding Iran's nuclear ambitions. A few years ago, the United States withdrew from that arrangement. And there have been a wide variety of security-related disruptions across the region. Not all of it caused by the changes I've just talked about, but all of it impacted by the changes I've just talked about. There are some in this town, I am actually among them, who argue today Iran may enjoy one of the strongest strategic positions it has enjoyed since the revolution, because of their increased military capabilities, their increased involvement in proxy operations around the region. But whether that's true or not, I'd like your perspective. I'm sure many people in the audience would be listening very intently to your perspective on what, first of all, do you believe the United States and Israel should be doing together related to this problem? And then if you wish, please add your perspective on whether the Abraham Accords that we just talked about have an impact here. Over to you.
From the Israeli perspective, the Iranian nuclear project, military nuclear project, should be stopped by one way or another. Israel can't tolerate a military nuclear Iran with all the implications to the region from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and other countries. For a better future of the Middle East, we claim that the Iranians shouldn't have a nuclear bomb. Now, looking back to more than a decade regarding this regime led by Supreme Leader Khamenei, in two cases, Khamenei decided to suspend the project. The first one was in 2003, after the Operation Iraqi Freedom. Rogue leaders in the region, to include Muammar Gaddafi, didn't want to be targeted in the third phase of the offensive, which didn't implement at the time. But both of them sought to believe that it might be targeted after Afghanistan phase 1, Iraq phase 2. Muammar Gaddafi gave up his military nuclear project without a single shot, and Khamenei suspended the project for a year and a half, when he realized that Washington lost its political stomach to go on with the offensive. The second time was 2012, in the time of Obama administration. The strategy consists of political isolation of the regime, crippling economic sanctions, and a credible military option, whether it is an Israeli or American or both. Brought him to the dilemma whether to go on with the project or to survive as a regime. That was the dilemma in 2012. In that point, he decided to be engaged with the great Satan America, to sit to the table. Unfortunately, it was a missing opportunity. The outcome was the JCPOA of 2015. Having said that, the withdrawal of Trump administration from the JCPOA was a tremendous mistake. I said it even before the decision to withdraw. Why? It gave an excuse to Iran to run in the project as they do it now. They are in the best situation since the beginning of the project, which I look at it since the 90s when I served as the head of the intelligence in our country. And of course, United States lost its coalition, the P5+1, the European countries. And I claim that at this point, before talking about a military option, in order to rehabilitate the pressure upon this regime with such an experience, the US administration should have called for a new coalition, which includes, in this case, the Arab regimes as well, part of the Abraham Accord. We are on the same side. But to rehabilitate the UN Security Council resolution of June 2010, China and Russia voted for it. Not talking about rehabilitating the relationship with NATO, with European countries, in order to create a coalition which will put the Khamenei again in the same dilemma. Not just about the enrichment, about the nuclear capability as a whole, about the missiles, about the terror activities in the region, which harm our interest, Israel's interest, our country's interest, I claim that European and US interest as well. So my proposal for the United States is let's try to rehabilitate this kind of policy, political isolation of the regime, especially after the nomination of Raisi as the president. It is easier than the nice faces of Rouhani and Zarif, crippling economic sanctions, and to try to bring on board with all difficulties China and Russia. We did it in the past. It can be done now as well, I claim, and to have a credible military option demonstrated by the United States as well as Israel. We claim that if you aspire for peace, be ready for war.
Thank you, General. I'm going to take a couple of elements out of some of the questions that I'm seeing on the Q&A function and blend them together into, I'm going to ask you a follow-on here, and then I'm going to come to Mick for his perspective, both on the original Iran question I posed, but also on this follow-on question I'm about to ask you. Shifting away from Iran, the nation state, but to other things that Iran is certainly involved in. I mentioned its use of proxies, so we can turn to places like Yemen, for example, where they are clearly supporting the conflict that emerged in Yemen several years ago now. What is the right approach for Israel, the United States, and perhaps some connection to the Abraham Accords as well? Is there a better path available to us now for somehow resolving this ugly, interminable conflict in Yemen by working with your country and other countries of the region, or is this just intractable?
The Iranian regime has become to be the main generator and instigator for instability in the region. And we can find the Iranian fingerprints in Lebanon. Lebanon has been abducted by the Iranian regime. Hezbollah can't exist without the Iranian political, economic, military support. Very important to deal with it. In Syria, all the Iranian activities to deploy threatening deployments against us, which according to foreign sources, here and there, Israel is active in military operation to foil this intention, to have Shia militias, Iranian UAVs, rockets and missiles deployed by certain Iranian troops or Iranian proxies in Syria to threaten us. This is the case in Iraq. What is the American interest? To have an Iranian influenced Iraq or something else? And this is an ongoing conflict now. The idea to assassinate the Iraqi prime minister, what are the fingerprints? It's in Tehran. Yemen, threatening Saudi Arabia from its backyard. Activities in Bahrain to undermine the regime, using the Shia population in Bahrain, in North Africa as well. Iranian proxies challenging Morocco. So to deal just with the arms without dealing with the head, and the head is in Tehran, it's a tremendous mistake. So if we can unify our activities, of course, intelligence cooperation, military operations on a low scale today as we do it now, as well as a strategy which I just proposed earlier, this kind of thinking might bring about the regime to think that the next time for being in a dilemma to go on with its rogue activities on all fields, not just on the nuclear, or to survive as the regime. That should have been the American strategy, and not disengagement from the Middle East.
Thank you very much. All right, Mick, I realize between the two questions I've already posed on Iran, there's a complete PhD dissertation lurking in here somewhere, but relatively briefly, give me your perspective.
Right, so starting with the JCPOA from 2015, I think, and this goes to your question on the proxies, one of the key criticisms of that is it didn't cover, what we collectively call the malign activities of Iran, part of which is the use of proxies. So I think that was a fair criticism. Unfortunately, I'd agree it was a mistake just to get out of the agreement because we still didn't really address the issue of proxies. And I think empirically speaking, we could see that proxy activities actually increased after we withdrew, whether it was the attack in Saudi Arabia against our oil facilities and the UAE against their maritime facilities, against us and our unmanned aircraft. Everything that the general just laid out, you just laid out with the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Syria, and of course the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. They've done nothing but increase. They certainly haven't subsided. So we didn't successfully address those, in my opinion, and I think empirically speaking, by our withdrawal. And we saw an increase in enrichment, increase in storage, and a breaking of all the former restrictions from the agreement. So I know we can't undo that now, but I think we should all hope that the current efforts by Rob Malley, the special envoy of the United States to Iran, to get back into compliance, I think maybe not into the same agreement, would be helpful. The other point that was brought up that I agree, we have to have a credible military option here. And that means, as you know as well as anybody, the military is always planning. So I don't think that should be viewed as it is a given, but we have to have a plan ready and be prepared should that option be decided by the leadership. So I think we have to have that. I'd only caution that we shouldn't be overconfident in how that will go. We need to have a credible military option. I don't think we should necessarily rely on that. We should push on all fronts, intelligence side, my old world, diplomacy, and obviously hope that we can avoid that if it's necessarily. I hope it works, but I don't think we should necessarily just assume that is a given.
Thank you, Mick. Marwa, what's your perspective?
Well, I think I'll disagree on both counts. I think the JCPOA was mistaken primarily for what Mick said, ignoring the two aspects of the malign activities, the proxies and also the ballistic missiles. So as if it ignored all of that and went for the nuclear component only. And once it did that, it actually enabled Iran to think that these other two dimensions are okay to navigate and work in, and that's what happened. And I actually think that withdrawal from that deal as it was brought to the surface clearly what Iran is up to, what it really wants to do, what it's really doing. So it engaged more with the proxies in Yemen and in Lebanon and all of that, and we're witnessing that so that we can actually address it head on, in the sense of like confronting what's going on and not being delusional about it. So that's one thing. So I think we're in a spot where we have to rethink all of this instead of just putting things under the carpet, as we say. But now that I hear both Yalon and Mick saying, well, we're always prepared for military solutions, we're always going to be having plans, etc., etc., I really would like them then to lay out for us what kind of kinetic action might we even imagine? What is possible? What is likely, given that Iran is what it is? It's not Iraq, and it's not other. It's not a simple theater. It's not. So if we're in this corner now, what kind of action can we see if they are thinking about that?
Okay, that's a fair question. Mick, let me go first to you. I mean, you and I both have plenty of scar tissue of endless discussions, all classified, of course, about, potential war plans and what kinds of resources it would take. We can't get into any of those details here, but in an unclassified sense, in a broad sense, how would you react to what Marwa just said?
So I think classification is the key word there, Mike. So I don't think I can get into our actual, well, I know I can't get into our actual plans for how this is done. My only cautionary tale is I don't think, even as powerful as the United States and Israel is when it comes to their military capabilities, that we shouldn't view it as, okay, now we're going to pull the trigger and this is going to be resolved. So that's what I was trying to say. I don't want to get into specifics. I think, as a person who spent, well, I was in the military first, in the agency, and the military again, so to speak. But I spent most of my operational time in the agency. And I can say, at the end of my career, when I saw what the capability really saw from an insider perspective, when it came to this, just the strikes that happened in Syria, I was in awe, to be quite frank. I'm biased and everybody knows that, but I was in awe. I was really super impressive. So I would say that we have incredible capabilities. Israel does too. Combined, we have the sum of the parts. I would hope they were not have to be used. And that's what I would be really clear on that. I think that's, we should hope again that this effort to get them back into compliance, and I agree, we weren't addressing a lot of the proxy activities, as Marwa said. Even after we withdrew, we didn't really address the proxy activity. So I just would like to see them all addressed, but certainly would want to see, as the general pointed out, a nuclear powered Iran, which would completely destabilize the region and threaten peace for sure.
Thank you. General Yalon, I'm going to ask you to be brief about this, but I do want to give you the opportunity to respond to the question Marwa has asked about what would an effective military approach be?
You know, we can't compare the military and nuclear infrastructure in Iran to Osirak in Iraq or the Yungavyon reactor in Syria. But this is the wrong way to look at it. It's like, you know, trying to intercept any rocket launcher in the Middle East. At the end, if you want to put Hezbollah as well as Hamas in the corner or any other enemy, you have to charge him with heavy price in a way that we think about launching rockets. That's what we do. That's what we did. So the United States as well as Israel has the military capabilities to put Iran in the dilemma by charging the Iranian regime with heavy price in order to put him in such a dilemma, whether to go on with their activities, not intercepting any centrifuge, or to survive. This is my proposal.
Thank you. All right, General Yalon, I'm going to come back to you because I didn't want to get through this entire hour without talking about Turkey. You mentioned Turkey in your opening remarks. I want to return to it. There is an argument in Washington, D.C. that Turkey has become an enormous strategic spoiler, not just in the Middle East, but potentially other regions of the world as well. Whether or not that's true, what is your perspective on the role Turkey now plays? And if it needs to be altered or improved, what should the United States and Israel do?
I absolutely agree with the term spoiler in the Middle East as regard to Erdogan. And I enjoyed very much the relationship with Turkey until 2002 or 4. He was elected in 2002. From 2004, I was a chief of general staff. At the time, I realized that Turkey is going in a very different way. Instead of it being a strategic friend, ally of Israel, which was the case until 2004, he decided to propose the idea of Neo-Ottoman Empire, to associate with Hamas, not even with Abu Mazen or the Palestinian Authority, to encourage the Muslim Brotherhood, like in Egypt, till today, to have military deployment in Qatar, the Turkish-Qatari axis, and more than that. So, and of course, to allow the illegal immigration to Europe, to Islamize Europe. I still remember my visit to Greece on February 2016, being briefed about the 800,000 Muslims coming from Turkey by rubber boats, 5 miles sailing to Europe, to the Greek islands. It was directed, supported, pushed. We had all the information that Erdogan was behind it. So in this regard, in one hand, a NATO member, on the other hand, spoiler of US interest, European interest, Israeli interest. Of course, we and the Arab regimes are on the same page regarding the Erdogan aspirations. And I claim, not just from today, from the past as well, that Erdogan should be put on under pressure, whether to go on with such rogue activities against European interests, against American interests, or to start to behave himself. There were certain cases in which the United States used the stick against Erdogan, but it's not enough. Not mentioning the Kurdish sector, nowadays a new Turkish offensive against the Kurds in Iraq and Syria. So there are many issues to be settled with Erdogan, even by sticks, not just by carrots.
Thank you. Marwa, what is your perspective on what the impact of Turkish behavior is these days and what is to be done about it?
I've written extensively on Turkey and Turkey-Qatar alliance, and actually it's interesting that Turkey it's finally brought as an element that is perceived as a threat in the region as well, because the emphasis throughout since 2008 or so was on Iran exclusively. Iran is the main problem and nobody talks about Turkey. And that was almost a point of contention between Egypt, for example, and the United States over the Muslim Brotherhood, the Sunni version of pan-Islamism, basically. For a while, there was a sense that it's only the Shia version of Iran that is exporting revolutionary Islamism that is a problem, ignoring Turkey. But no, I agree that Turkey is that threat. But I would only say that, having observed that over the past decade, I think actually Turkey now and that version of pan-Islamism is actually subsiding and deterred. It peaked, it's already going down. It's not as invasive as it used to be back in 2013, 14, 15. So in a sense, I think Erdogan got the signals and he's very pragmatic and responsive in a sense, and he knows where to stop when he needs to, and he is pushed to. So I think we've done some of what General Yalon is saying already. So I'm okay with where things are heading now vis-a-vis Turkey.
Okay, a note of optimism. Mick, what's your view? And I want to remind everybody in the audience that it's at least a minor complicating factor here is that although we shifted Israel from European Command to Central Command, we didn't do that with Turkey. I don't know how much that complicates things, but over to you.
That's a good point, Mike. So I'd start with saying that the country of Turkey is and should be a key ally now and into the future. And I would agree that a lot of the issues that we're discussing that have been identified are really the current government. They have been, I think, a spoiler in many ways, and it didn't just start. I mean, you can go back to our efforts in the beginning of the war in Iraq, which you could agree with or not agree with, but I think we would have expected a little more cooperation from a NATO ally when it came to having our forces simply transit their country to create two fronts so that we could essentially end the initial confrontation quicker. They didn't allow that. And then as the points were just raised, they were a significantly complicating factor in the global coalition's effort to defeat ISIS in Syria. So that was an 80-country coalition. And I think it was seriously challenged by the actions of Turkey. And then, of course, the purchasing of the S-400. At the same time, they wanted the most advanced aircraft that the United States has. So I think we've seen a lot of things that are just not consistent with a key ally. And I would like to see that change. So I take Marwa's optimism. I hope there is reason for optimism in the future, and I think she has a reason to say that. So I'd like to see that happen. But there is a challenge, and I think all people in Washington that I talk to recognize it as a challenge and something that needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much. All right, I knew this would happen. We have 7 minutes left, and I've got, between what I see on chat and what I had already pre-prepared, I have 5 times more questions than we have time for. So I'm not going to do any of that. Instead, I'm going to give each of you an opportunity, whether it's in the context of the discussion, the very rich discussion we've now had for about 55 minutes, or something we didn't raise, something I neglected to answer. This will be your final opportunity. So General Yalon, if you like, I will start with you.
Thank you, Mike. Looking to the new situation of the Middle East, I believe that the struggle for hegemony in the Middle East today is not for external powers, not even the United States or Russia, internal powers. On top of it, Iran, claiming for hegemony, exporting the revolution, and they feel like they're on the march with their presence in Lebanon, vis-a-vis Hezbollah and more, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and other places. They want to see Shia Middle East, and even more than that. This is the idea of exporting the ideology, the revolution. The second element claiming for hegemony, jihadists claiming for Islamic Caliphate. There are ups and downs, IS, Islamic State, Daesh, ISIS, and so forth are still active. but they are not threatening the Middle East as a whole. The third element claiming for hegemony, we mentioned Erdogan, claiming for having a new neo-Ottoman empire based on the Muslim Brotherhood. Three radical Islamic ideologies claiming for hegemony. That's first of all my diagnosis as the whole picture. Now we have to look at it, and I believe in what I call a strategy based on interests. Not wishful thinking, not patronism of the elements in the region. And of course, in this regard, I claim that generally speaking, Israel with the Arab countries, the Arab regimes, on the same page. I believe that should have been the case with the United States as well. And in order to bring about the right strategy, which I mentioned earlier regarding Iran, regarding Turkey, of course, the jihadists as a whole, fighting terrorism in the region, CENTCOM, of course, the US administration, Israel, the Gulf states should sit together to bring about this kind of strategy and to have this kind of efforts to bring aboard the Europeans, Russia and China. I talked with them, with China, Russia. They don't want to have nuclear Iran as an example. They need the oil, there's the Chinese. So let's find a way, as we found in 2010, to be on the same page regarding the grand strategy, which might bring about a more stabilized Middle East in this challenge of instability, which is one of the characteristics of the Middle East. And I claim that I can't talk about any kind of solution. We should talk about way. I published a book, was translated to English last year. The longer path is a shorter one. Let's forget about solutions. Let's forget about, I call it solutionism and nowism. Let's talk about a way, a long-run strategy, which will serve our interests. Thank you.
Thank you. I love that phrase. The longer path is the shorter one. Thank you. Mick, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, Mike. So I think I just reiterate that although I totally agree with the priorities laid out in the U.S. national security strategy and defense strategy that came from it on China and Russia, that shouldn't be tied to geography and just locations on the map. So that if we want to be world leaders, we need to be engaged throughout the world. We need to compete with those two countries throughout the world. We should probably just get rid of the term pivot and just accept that we're going to be key partners to our key partners, period. We might have to shift resources based on the current, intelligence picture on the ground, but that's okay. We should stop talking about this as if it's an all or nothing thing, because it's just not the way, in my opinion, we should view the world. Nor should we allow our partners to actually think we view the world that way, because it seems to be that we're nonstop deciding whether we should be in a place at all, and that's just not the case, and not what historically our actions are. So I would just I would highlight that. I think the Abraham Accords were positive in stabilization in the region, and I hope they continue, and I think they will. And I do think we all have to hope that the diplomatic effort, and I think the U.S.'s diplomatic effort should always lead, the diplomatic effort to get Iran back into compliance, which obviously has a lot to do with what Iran does, we should all hope is the case, because the military action, although substantial, is not where we want to end up. But we should be prepared. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Mick. Marwa, you get the last word, and I hope that this forum, which was a result of your long labors and expertise, has been satisfying you. But what are your final thoughts?
Well, I'll build on both comments. I agree with what both Jerry, Alon, and Mick said. I will add that maybe, the issue of pan-Islamism in various forms has been the feature for the past decade or longer. But I think moving forward, I think there will be shrinking of that. And there would be an opportunity, if we were to mention the Palestinians at this juncture, for a Palestinian state that would not be, a follower of either an Iran with its proxy in Gaza or a Turkey supporting Hamas. So there would be a future even for the Palestinians who might feel left out of all of these. We're talking Israel with all these states in the Abraham Accord and Morocco and even Sudan, and the Palestinians feels out of this. But I think the future for them would have to be built on a future where there is no hegemonic pan-Islamism in the region, states respecting their borders and respecting their neighbors. So I'm actually optimistic that down the road, that will be the change, since everything changes and we've been in these decades long enough. So I think the outlook is that 30 years from now, we're going to see a very different Middle East that would include the Palestinians as well.
Thank you. And we are now officially out of time. So the only thing that is left is for me to say a few thank yous before signing off. First and foremost, thank you to our panelists. General Yalon, Marwa, Mick, thank you for contributing to this rich dialogue about an incredibly complex set of topics, yet incredibly important. I want to thank all of those of you in our audience who took the time and trouble to dial in. I hope you have profited from this rich discussion as well. And of course, thanks to the Middle East Institute for being the host of this important event. I wish all of you great good fortune in the future. Stay safe, stay well. Godspeed to you. Bye-bye.